Position of Peter in the Apostolic Church. Given the information supplied by the Gospels, it is not unexpected that Peter should emerge immediately after Jesus' death as the leader of the earliest church. For approximately 15 years after the resurrection, the figure of Peter dominated the community. He presided over the appointment of Saint Matthias as an apostle, Acts chapter 1 verses 23 to 26, to take the place of Judas, who had betrayed Christ and later died. It was Peter who first raised his voice and preached at Pentecost, the day when the church began its mission to the world, Acts chapter 1 verses 14 to 39. It was Peter who served as an advocate for the apostles before the Jewish religious court in Jerusalem, Acts chapter 4 verses 5 to 22. And it was he who exercised the role of judge in the disciplining of those who erred within the church, Acts chapter 5 verses 1 to 10. Peter led the 12 apostles in extending the church, here and there among them all, Acts chapter 9 verse 32. He went first to the Samaritans, Acts chapter 8 verses 4 to 17, who received the Holy Spirit. In Samaria he encountered the magician and faith healer Simon Magus. Then he went to Lydda, in the plain of Sharon, Acts chapter 9 verses 32 to 35, where he healed the paralyzed Aeneas. Then, at the Mediterranean coastal town of Joppa, Acts chapter 9 verses 36 to 43, he effected the cure of Tabitha, Dorcas, in the name of Christ. He went farther north on the Mediterranean coast to Caesarea, Acts chapter 10 verse 1-11 to 18, where, through the conversion of Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, Acts chapter 10 verse 1, Peter introduced Gentiles into the church. According to Jewish requirements, a Gentile convert must first become a Jew through the rite of circumcision and be acceptable as a proselyte. In accepting Cornelius and the others, who may have had some informal connection with the synagogue, Acts chapter 10 verse 1, and ordering them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, Acts chapter 10 verse 48, without submission to the prior rite of circumcision, Peter introduced an innovation that ensured the opposition of the Jewish Christians and others. This independent course, set by Peter with the blessing of the Spirit, Acts chapter 10 verses 10 to 15, was possibly a factor in Herod's beheading of Saint James, the brother of John, and in the arrest of Peter, Acts chapter 12 verse 2-3. In prison, circa 44 CE, Peter was visited by an angel of the Lord, and the chains fell off his hands, and he made his escape, Acts chapter 12 verses 1 to 8. He went immediately to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, Acts chapter 12 verse 12. After asking them to report his escape to James and to the brethren, he went to another place, Acts chapter 12 verse 17. At this point the unchallenged leadership of Peter in Jerusalem came to an end. It is not at all clear where Peter went, but it is not probable that the words, to another place, refer to a different home in the same general area that would provide temporary refuge. The later work of Peter is not covered in Acts, perhaps because the author of Luke Acts had planned a third book that would have included such a discussion, but the book was never written or was written and later lost. Perhaps the events would have included unedifying material, such as the internal jealousy within the church referred to in the first letter of Clement 4-6, or perhaps the author died before completion of his work. Whatever momentary glimpses into the period of the later ministry of Peter remain can only be noted in a discussion of his relationship with the two other outstanding apostles of the time, Saint James and Saint Paul. Peter was the most prominent figure in the Jerusalem church up to the time of his departure from Jerusalem after his imprisonment by King Herod and his subsequent release in the New Testament account, Acts chapter 12 verses 1 to 17. For example, Paul went up to Jerusalem to consult with Peter 3 years after he was converted, and he remained with Peter for 2 weeks, Galatians chapter 1 verses 18-19. When Peter left Jerusalem, however, it appears clear to many New Testament scholars, although unconvincing to others, that he assumed a missionary role while the actual leadership of the church devolved upon James, the brother of the Lord. This sequence of authority is suggested by Peter's obedience to the wishes of certain persons who came from James, and hence his ceasing to eat with Gentile Christians at Antioch, Galatians chapter 2 verses 11 to 14, by a final summing up of decisions made in the so-called Apostolic Council of Jerusalem, Acts chapter 15 verse 7, by James. and later, when Peter made his departure from the home of the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. By the word of explanation or report of his whereabouts left primarily for James, Acts chapter 12 verse 17. Paul first met with Peter at Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. In the record of this meeting, the name of Cephas, Peter, precedes that of James, although Galatians notes that in another meeting 14 years later the name of James precedes that of Cephas, Galatians chapter 2 verse 9. Paul also emphasizes an incident involving himself and Peter at Antioch. Apparently, Paul had achieved some success in the difficult matter of welding the Jewish and Gentile Christians of Antioch into one congregation. The Jewish Christians saw the sharing of food with Gentiles as quite alien to their tradition. In the absence of Paul, Peter, perhaps in his capacity as missionary, visited Antioch and ate with the united group. Later, certain persons came from James, and opposed the united congregation's custom of eating together. In apparent deference to James, Peter drew back and began to hold aloof, and the Jewish Christians did likewise. The unity of the group had been destroyed. When Paul returned, he upbraided Peter for what he may have considered Peter's vacillation or perhaps even purposeful disruption. Galatians chapter 2 verses 11 to 14. This incident may have occasioned the Jerusalem Council, 49 or 50 CE, in which it was settled that hereafter Paul should be entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, Galatians chapter 2 verse 7, and Peter for the mission to the circumcised, Galatians chapter 2 verse 8. In passing, Paul refers to a party of Cephas, Peter, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 12 that suggests that a group in the church of Corinth was especially devoted to Peter, leading some to assume a residence of Peter in Corinth, and refers to Peter in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 5 as carrying on missionary activity accompanied by his wife. A missionary journey to Asia Minor may be suggested in the first letter of Peter chapter 1 verse 1. Tradition of Peter in Rome. The problems surrounding the residence, martyrdom, and burial of Peter are among the most complicated of all those encountered in the study of the New Testament and the early church. The absence of any reference in Acts or Romans to a residence of Peter in Rome gives pause but is not conclusive. If Peter did write 1 Peter, the mention of Babylon in 5:13 is fairly reliable evidence that Peter resided at some time in the capital city. If Peter was not the author of the first epistle that bears his name, the presence of this cryptic reference witnesses at least to a tradition of the late 1st or early 2nd century. Babylon is a cryptic term indicating Rome, and it is the understanding utilized in Revelation chapter 14 verse 8, 16:19, 17-5, 6 and in the works of various Jewish seers. It may be said that by the end of the 1st century there existed a tradition that Peter had lived in Rome. Further early evidence for the tradition is found in the letter to the Romans by Saint Ignatius, the early 2nd century bishop of Antioch. It is probable that the tradition of a 25-year episcopate of Peter in Rome is not earlier than the beginning or the middle of the 3rd century. The claims that the Church of Rome was founded by Peter or that he served as its first bishop are in dispute and rest on evidence that is not earlier than the middle or late 2nd century. Words of John chapter 21 verses 18-19 clearly refer to the death of Peter and are cast into the literary form of prophecy. The author of this chapter is aware of a tradition concerning the martyrdom of Peter when the apostle was an old man. And there is a possible reference here to crucifixion as the manner of his death. But as to when or where the death took place, there is not so much as a hint. The strongest evidence to support the thesis that Peter was martyred in Rome is to be found in the letter to the Corinthians, circa 96 CE, 5-1-6-4, of Saint Clement of Rome. These sources, plus the suggestions and implications of later works, combine to lead many scholars to accept Rome as the location of the martyrdom and the reign of Nero as the time. As part of the general question of Peter's residence and martyrdom in Rome, debated since the appearance of the Defensor Passus of Marsilius of Padua, circa 1275 c. 1342, the particular question of where Peter was buried has been argued. There is not the slightest hint at a solution in the New Testament. The earliest evidence, circa 200 CE, is found in a fragment of a work by Saint Gaius, Archies, witnessing to a tradition at least a generation earlier, circa 165 CE, that the trophy, i.e., tropion, or monument, of Peter was located at the Vatican. Though difficult to interpret, the use of the word trophy indicates that in this period the Vatican area was associated with either the tomb of the apostle or simply a monument erected in the area of Peter's victory, i.e., his martyrdom. Some scholars find support for a tradition that the apostle was buried ad catacumbas, at the catacombs of San Sebastiano, on the Via Appia in an inscription of Saint Damasus I, Pope, 366–384, composed in such ambiguous terms that it was certain to foster such misinterpretations as are found in the letter of Saint Gregory the Great to the Empress Constantina and in the notice of Pope Street Cornelius in the Liber Pontificalis. Apart from the aforementioned, later literary tradition is unanimous in indicating the Vatican Hill as the place of burial. See Parastephanon 12 of Prudentius, various notices in the Liber Pontificalis, and the Salzburg Itinerary. Liturgical sources such as the Depositio Martyrum and the Martyrologium Hieronymianum, though interesting, add nothing to the literary evidence. Excavations were begun in the late 19th century in order to substantiate the theory that the burial of Peter and Paul was ad catacumbas. After a half-century of investigation, it now seems reasonable to concede that a cult of the apostles existed there about 260 CE, though Christian influence may have been exerted as early as 200 CE. None of the excavations, however, in all of the areas indicated at various times as the resting place of the apostolic relics, have produced any evidence whatsoever that the bodies of Peter and Paul were either buried there originally or brought there at a later time after earlier burials elsewhere. In the early 4th century the Emperor Constantine, died 337 CE, with considerable difficulty erected a basilica on the Vatican Hill. The difficulty of the task, combined with the comparative ease with which this great church might have been built on level ground only a slight distance to the south, may support the contention that the emperor was convinced that the relics of Peter rested beneath the small aedicula, shrine for a small statue, over which he had erected the basilica. The task before the excavators was to determine whether or not the belief of Constantine accorded with the facts or was based merely upon a misunderstanding. The excavation of this site, which lies far beneath the high altar of the present Church of St. Peter, was begun in 1939. The problems encountered in excavation and interpretation of what has been discovered are extremely complex. There are some scholars who are convinced that a box found in one of the fairly late sidewalls of the aedicula contains fragments of the remains of the apostle, fragments which at an earlier, others are most definitely not convinced. If a grave of the apostle did exist in the area of the base of the aedicula, nothing identifiable of that grave remains today. Furthermore, the remains discovered in the box that until comparatively recently rested in the sidewall do not lead necessarily to a more positive conclusion. Archaeological investigation has not solved with any great degree of certainty the question of the location of the tomb of Peter. If it was not in the area of the aedicula, perhaps the grave rested elsewhere in the immediate vicinity, or perhaps the body was never recovered for burial at all. 5 festivals in the calendar of the Roman Catholic Church involve honor paid to Peter. In each the name of Paul is also associated. First chronologically, on January 18th is celebrated the festival of the Cathedra Petri, Latin, Chair of Peter, at Rome, and on February 22nd at Antioch. June 29th marks the festival of Peter and Paul, ranking among the 12 most important celebrations of the Roman Catholic Church. The escape of Peter from his chains is noted in the feast of August 1st. Last, the dedications of the basilicas of Peter and Paul, commemorating their construction by the Emperor Constantine, are celebrated in the festival of November 18th. Saint Paul the Apostle, original name Saul of Tarsus, born 4 BCE, Tarsus in Cilicia, now in Turkey, died circa 62 to 64 CE, Rome, Italy. One of the leaders of the first generation of Christians, often considered to be the most important person after Jesus in the history of Christianity. In his own day, although he was a major figure within the very small Christian movement, he also had many enemies and detractors, and his contemporaries probably did not accord him as much respect as they gave Peter and James. Paul was compelled to struggle, therefore, to establish his own worth and authority. His surviving letters, however, have had enormous influence on subsequent Christianity and secure his place as one of the greatest religious leaders of all time. Sources: Of the 27 books in the New Testament, 13 are attributed to Paul, and approximately half of another, Acts of the Apostles, deals with Paul's life and works. Thus, about half of the New Testament stems from Paul and the people whom he influenced. Only 7 of the 13 letters, however, can be accepted as being entirely authentic, dictated by Paul himself. The others come from followers writing in his name, who often used material from his surviving letters and who may have had access to letters written by Paul that no longer survive. Although frequently useful, the information in Acts is secondhand, and it is sometimes in direct conflict with the letters. The 7 undoubted letters constitute the best source of information on Paul's life and especially his thought. In the order in which they appear in the New Testament, they are Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. The probable chronological order, leaving aside Philemon, which cannot be dated, is 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and Romans. Letters considered Deutero-Pauline, probably written by Paul's followers after his death, are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus are Trito-Pauline, probably written by members of the Pauline school a generation after his death. Life. Paul was a Greek-speaking Jew from Asia Minor. His birthplace, Tarsus, was a major city in eastern Cilicia, a region that had been made part of the Roman province of Syria by the time of Paul's adulthood. 2 of the main cities of Syria, Damascus and Antioch, played a prominent part in his life and letters. Although the exact date of his birth is unknown, he was active as a missionary in the 40s and 50s of the 1st century CE. From this it may be inferred that he was born about the same time as Jesus, circa 4 BCE, or a little later. He was converted to faith in Jesus Christ about 33 CE, and he died, probably in Rome, circa 62 to 64 CE. In his childhood and youth, Paul learned how to work with his own hands, 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 12. His trade, tent making, which he continued to practice after his conversion to Christianity, helps to explain important aspects of his apostleship. He could travel with a few leather working tools and set up shop anywhere. It is doubtful that his family was wealthy or aristocratic, but, since he found it noteworthy that he sometimes worked with his own hands, it may be assumed that he was not a common laborer. His letters are written in Koine, or common, Greek, rather than in the elegant literary Greek of his wealthy contemporary the Jewish philosopher Philo-Judaeus of Alexandria, and this too argues against the view that Paul was an aristocrat. Moreover, he knew how to dictate, and he could write with his own hand in large letters, Galatians chapter 6 verse 11, though not in the small, neat letters of the professional scribe. Until about the midpoint of his life, Paul was a member of the Pharisees, a religious party that emerged during the later Second Temple period. What little is known about Paul the Pharisee reflects the character of the Pharisaic movement. Pharisees believed in life after death, which was one of Paul's deepest convictions. They accepted non-biblical traditions as being about as important as the written Bible. Paul refers to his expertise in traditions, Galatians chapter 1 verse 14. Pharisees were very careful students of the Hebrew Bible, and Paul was able to quote extensively from the Greek translation. It was fairly easy for a bright, ambitious young boy to memorize the Bible, and it would have been very difficult and expensive for Paul as an adult to carry around dozens of bulky scrolls. By his own account, Paul was the best Jew and the best Pharisee of his generation, Philippians chapter 3 verses 4 to 6, Galatians chapter 1 verses 13 to 14, though he claimed to be the least apostle of Christ, 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 22 to 3, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 9 to 10, and attributed his successes to the grace of God. Paul spent much of the first half of his life persecuting the nascent Christian movement, an activity to which he refers several times. Paul's motivations are unknown, but they seem not to have been connected to his Pharisaism. The chief persecutors of the Christian movement in Jerusalem were the high priest and his associates, who were Sadducees, if they belonged to one of the parties, and Acts depicts the leading Pharisee, Gamaliel, as defending the Christians, Acts chapter 5 verse 34. It is possible that Paul believed that Jewish converts to the new movement were not sufficiently observant of the Jewish law, that Jewish converts mingled too freely with Gentile, non-Jewish, converts, thus associating themselves with idolatrous practices, or that the notion of a crucified Messiah was objectionable. The young Paul certainly would have rejected the view that Jesus had been raised after his death, not because he doubted resurrection as such, but because he would not have believed that God chose to favor Jesus by raising him before the time of the judgment of the world. Whatever his reasons, Paul's persecutions probably involved traveling from synagogue to synagogue and urging the punishment of Jews who accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Disobedient members of synagogues were punished by some form of ostracism or by light flogging, which Paul himself later suffered at least 5 times, 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 24, though he does not say when or where. According to Acts, Paul began his persecutions in Jerusalem, a view at odds with his assertion that he did not know any of the Jerusalem followers of Christ until well after his own conversion. Galatians chapter 1 verses 4 to 17. Paul was on his way to Damascus when he had a vision that changed his life. According to Galatians chapter 1 verse 16, God revealed his Son to him. More specifically, Paul states that he saw the Lord, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 1, though Acts claims that near Damascus he saw a blinding bright light. Following this revelation, which convinced Paul that God had indeed chosen Jesus to be the promised Messiah, he went into Arabia, probably Coele Syria, west of Damascus, Galatians chapter 1 verse 17. He then returned to Damascus, and 3 years later he went to Jerusalem to become acquainted with the leading apostles there. After this meeting he began his famous missions to the west, preaching first in his native Syria and Cilicia, Galatians chapter 1 verses 17 to 24. During the next 20 years or so, circa mid-30s to mid-50s, he established several churches in Asia Minor and at least 3 in Europe, including the church at Corinth. During the course of his missions, Paul realized that his preaching to Gentiles was creating difficulties for the Christians in Jerusalem, who thought that Gentiles must become Jewish in order to join the Christian movement. To settle the issue, Paul returned to Jerusalem and struck a deal. It was agreed that Peter would be the principal apostle to Jews and Paul the principal apostle to Gentiles. Paul would not have to change his message, but he would take up a collection for the Jerusalem church, which was in need of financial support. Galatians chapter 2 verses 1 to 10, 2 Corinthians chapters 8 to 9, Romans chapter 15 verses 16 to 17, 25 to 26, though Paul's Gentile churches were hardly well off. In Romans chapter 15 verses 16 to 17, Paul seems to interpret the offering of the Gentiles symbolically, suggesting that it is the prophesied Gentile pilgrimage to the Temple of Jerusalem, with their wealth in their hands, e.g., Isaiah chapter 60 verses 1 to 6. It is also obvious that Paul and the Jerusalem apostles made a political bargain not to interfere in each other's spheres. The circumcision faction of the Jerusalem apostles, Galatians chapter 2 verses 12 to 13, which argued that converts should undergo circumcision as a sign of accepting the covenant between God and Abraham, later broke this agreement by preaching to the Gentile converts both in Antioch, Galatians chapter 2 verse 12, and Galatia, and insisting that they be circumcised, leading to some of Paul's strongest invective, Galatians chapter 1 verses 7 to 9, 3 to 1, 5, 2 to 12, 6, 12, 13. In the late 50s, Paul returned to Jerusalem with the money he had raised and a few of his Gentile converts. There he was arrested for taking a Gentile too far into the temple precincts, and, after a series of trials, he was sent to Rome. Later Christian tradition favors the view that he was executed there, 1 Clement 5 to 1:7, perhaps as part of the executions of Christians ordered by the Roman Emperor Nero following the Great Fire in the city in 64 CE.